Zachary was questioned by Serenity about their involvement in the operation and whether they had intended to use Sonia as bait. Insisting that the Buckums had seen Mrs. Newman's peculiar conduct the day before the tragedy, Zachary adamantly denied any deliberate arrangements. They had stepped up their efforts to keep Liberty and Sonia safe, but they had underestimated Liberty's commitment to doing so as a mother. Even though her sister was unaware of the covert protection, Serenity appreciated her sister's unshakable devotion and instinct to save Sonia. Serenity wiped away her tears and questioned why they hadn't notified Liberty about Jessica's involvement, as Zachary blamed himself for the inadequate protection. Zachary said that Liberty had tipped him up to Jessica's possible guilt. Liberty wouldn't let Hank take Sonia away by himself. She insisted on following Hank and Jessica. Zachary was stumped when Serenity questioned why Liberty hadn't informed her of this knowledge. She questioned Mr. Buckham about the proof and whether he had it. She was told by Zachary that Julian had the proof. Serenity questioned their decision to hold off on calling the police. Zachary indicated that Mrs. Newman's men were dispersed and that if one of them had been arrested, the others would have been made aware. In order to capture Mrs. Newman and the majority of her collaborators, they had decided to wait for her to act. Even if they couldn't catch them all, their goal was to capture as many of them as they could. Realizing that Sonia had been a tool in their plans, Serenity softly touched his face. She was reassured that it wasn't her fault by Zachary, who was unable to speak. He reminded her that she would have lived with remorse her entire life if she hadn't stepped in to help Cameron in the past. Serenity remained torn, doubting the ethics of her deeds. Zachary told Serenity that no one involved in the confusion and interference had been able to flee. They had all of them, maybe 100 of them, successfully captured. The sheer number of people Mrs. Newman had enlisted in her program astounded Serenity. She recalled Cameron's caution about Mrs. Newman's tendency toward impulsivity and how she had inherited that trait from her mother. Zachary remarked that Mr. Newman was probably ignorant of Mrs. Newman's conduct while they considered whether or not to exclude him from the situation. The majority of Julian's research was used against Mrs. Newman. Serenity guessed that Mr. Newman may have wanted to make Mrs. Newman the victim, using her as a fall guy. Zachary concurred, reflecting on the unexpected dynamics of the coupling. Both of the couple's phones started ringing as they were speaking. They returned the calls in an effort to learn more about the unexpected interruption. Serenity confronted Zachary about their involvement and the use of Sonia in their schemes in this chapter. They talk about Julian's proof, Liberty's suspicions, and their plan to apprehend Mrs. Newman and her cronies. The chapter emphasized Serenity's internal conflict and her consideration of her earlier deeds.